They said wild horses never sought humans, but one gray mare shattered that belief. She followed a broken farmer across the Wyoming plains, her dark eyes carrying a secret that would defy the law, ignite whispers across town, and force him to choose between survival and compassion. When a fragile foal's cry rose from the earth, the truth was revealed. And nothing would ever be the same. The mornings on the Wyoming plains always carried the same sound, wind threading through the dried alfalfa, the soft creak of wooden gates, the distant lowing of cattle. Caleb Brooks had grown used to the repetition. At 48, he lived alone on his family's farm, a patch of land that seemed too large now that the laughter of children and the voice of his ex-wife no longer lingered in its rooms. He had chosen solitude not out of preference, but survival. Work kept him steady. It was the only thing that hadn't walked away. Each day, he wrote in a battered notebook. Rainfall totals, the height of grass, the time of sunrise. Numbers and notes filled the silence better than words ever could. That morning, he saddled his old pickup and drove out to check the north fence line. The air tasted of dust and sage, sharp enough to sting the throat. He parked near a ridge and stepped out, boots crunching against gravel. Somewhere beyond the wire, a raven cut across the sky, its shadow falling and vanishing like a fleeting thought. Caleb bent, tightened a loose strand of barbed wire, then straightened, brushing sweat from his forehead. That was when he felt it, eyes on his back. Turning, he froze. Not far behind him, half hidden by the shimmer of heat, stood a gray mare. Her coat held the color of storm ash, her mane tangled, her chest rising and falling in quick breaths. Wild horses never came this close. They avoided people like fire. Yet here she was, standing with a stillness that felt intentional, her gaze fixed on him. Caleb's hand tightened on his glove. He had seen mustangs on the ridge before, but always as streaks of movement, never waiting, never watching. He took a step forward. The mare flicked her ears but did not move. Her eyes, dark and deep, carried something he could not name. He lowered his hand, whispering more to himself than to her. Easy now, no trouble here. The words disappeared into the wind. After a long moment, she turned, trotted a few paces, then stopped again, looking over her shoulder as if checking whether he followed. Caleb frowned. The behavior was strange, purposeful. Still, he shook his head and went back to the fence. Curiosity was a dangerous thing on land where every day demanded discipline. He could not let himself wander into fantasies. Yet when he finished his work and headed back to the truck, the mare was there again, further down the trail, her presence like a shadow that refused to be shaken. The road stretched empty, the horizon wide, but she kept her distance while staying in sight. Caleb climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove slowly. Dust rose behind the tires. Glancing in the mirror, he saw her silhouette, blurred by the haze, pacing, keeping time with him. By the time he reached the farmhouse, the mare was gone. Only the hush of evening settled across the yard. Caleb fed the cattle, stacked the bales, and sat on the porch with his notebook. He wrote about the fence repair, the weather. Yet his hand hesitated before the blank space, as though another note begged to be written. He thought of those eyes, the quiet insistence. He closed the notebook instead, unwilling to give shape to something he did not understand. Inside the house, the walls echoed with absence. Caleb cooked a simple meal, the kind he ate without tasting. Later, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in rust and gold, He found himself scanning the horizon, waiting for movement. The silence pressed heavier than usual, carrying with it a question he could not silence. Why had that horse chosen to follow him? When darkness settled and the first stars appeared, Caleb stood by the window, arms folded. Somewhere out there, in the sea of grass and sage, a wild mare moved with intention. He exhaled, long and slow, almost a sigh. He told himself it was nothing, just coincidence. But in the marrow of his bones, in the quiet chamber of his chest, he knew it was the beginning of something he could neither predict nor control. And as he turned away from the glass, the last thing he saw was a pale shadow crossing the far edge of his pasture, as if the wild itself had stepped closer, unwilling to let him go. The following morning broke clear and sharp, sunlight pouring across the Wyoming plain in long, golden beams. Caleb Brooks stepped outside with his coffee mug warming his palm, the scent of roasted beans cutting through the dry air. The world felt ordinary at first. The cattle moved slow along the pasture. The wind carried the smell of hay and earth. But when his eyes swept the ridge, he felt that ordinary falter. The gray mare was there again, distant but undeniable, a shape etched against the horizon like a shadow carved from the wind itself. Caleb set his cup down, frowning. Wild horses roamed these parts, sure, but never twice in the same place, never lingering near a man's land without cause. She did not graze, did not wander. She stood with the same uncanny stillness as yesterday, her body turned half toward him, half toward the expanse beyond. For a long while, neither moved. He almost laughed at himself, 48 years old, alone, staring at a horse as if waiting for her to speak. He shook his head and muttered under his breath, "You've lost it, Caleb." Yet when he turned to fetch his tools, something in him kept listening for her hooves. Later, as he drove out to deliver bales along the south field, he spotted her again, keeping pace across the distance. Each time his truck slowed, her stride slowed. Each time he turned, she veered with him. Dust trailed behind his tires, shimmering in the light, and within it her outline hovered. Present, persistent. Caleb gripped the wheel tighter, unsettled by the silent companionship. He tried to dismiss it, but the image clung like burrs on wool. By late afternoon, storm clouds gathered over the high desert. Caleb hurried to secure equipment, the scent of ozone sharp in the air. As he worked, a flicker of movement caught his eye. The mare closer than ever before. She stood near the edge of the corral, ears pricked, her coat damp from the first scatter of rain. Her breath steamed in short bursts. Caleb froze with a coil of rope in hand. She wasn't just following now. She was watching him with something deeper than curiosity. A streak of lightning split the horizon, followed by thunder that rolled like the earth groaning. Cattle shifted uneasily. The mare did not flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, one deliberate pace, then another, until only the fence stood between them. Caleb's pulse thudded. He had the strange sense that she wanted him to notice something more than her presence. The rain began to fall harder, drops striking the tin roof of the barn in staccato beats. He found himself whispering, as though to soothe her, "What is it you want?" His voice barely carried above the storm. The mare blinked slowly, water dripping from her forelock. She pawed the ground once, twice, then tossed her head toward the north ridge before meeting his eyes again. It was no random gesture. Caleb's chest tightened. He knew the land too well to ignore the direction. Beyond that ridge lay stretches of dry basin, an unforgiving place where herds sometimes strayed. Yet why would she point him there? He almost stepped forward, but a gust of wind rattled the fence, breaking the fragile moment. The mare spun, galloped a short distance, and vanished into sheets of rain, leaving Caleb drenched, rope slack in his hand, with 100 unspoken questions. That night, thunder still rumbling in the distance, Caleb sat at his kitchen table, notebook open. His pen scratched out the usual: rainfall measure, soil moisture, wind speed. But then his hand hovered. After a long hesitation, he wrote a single line beneath the data. Mare returned. Closer this time. Looked north. He stared at the words until the ink blurred. For years he had used the notebook as a ledger of facts, a record to ground himself. Now, for the first time, it carried a mystery he could not explain. Sleep eluded him. Each creak of the old farmhouse made him think of hooves outside. When at last he drifted off, the image followed him into dreams. The mare's eyes, steady and searching, and the way she turned her head to the north, as if urging him to follow. Morning came pale and cold. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean, the grass glittering with beads of water. Caleb poured coffee, muscles aching from restless sleep. Through the window, he caught a flicker of gray once more, farther out this time, poised on the ridgeline. She was waiting. He felt it like a pressure in his chest. As he stood there, the sound of gravel crunching announced a truck pulling into the yard. An old pickup rolled to a stop, and out stepped Jonah Blackbear, the Shoshone elder who lived on neighboring land. Jonah carried the weather in his face, lined deep from years of sun and wind. He raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, Caleb," Jonah said, voice low as the earth itself. His gaze swept the horizon, then narrowed. "You've got a shadow." Caleb followed his eyes. The mare still stood on the ridge, her figure etched sharp against the brightening sky. Jonah's expression shifted, something old flickering in his eyes. "Sometimes," he murmured, "a horse doesn't just wander. Sometimes it's scent." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Scent?" Jonah nodded slowly, his voice like gravel in water. "Long ago, when herds faced danger, they would send one to find help. Not often, not lightly. If she's watching you, son, it means something." The words hung heavy, more unsettling than the storm. Caleb looked back toward the ridge, where the mare still stood as if carved from the land itself. He wanted to dismiss Jonah's tale as superstition, but the memory of her eyes, the deliberate gesture toward the north, returned with a force he could not push away. He exhaled, a long breath that trembled. For the first time in years, the silence of the plains did not feel like peace. It felt like a summons. The wind had shifted after the storm, carrying with it a silence so clean it felt almost sacred. Caleb and Jonah stood side by side at the edge of the porch, both watching the ridge where the gray mare lingered like a sentinel. Jonah's eyes narrowed, as if he were reading something written across the hills that Caleb could not see. "She doesn't stand there for nothing," Jonah said finally, voice low. "My grandfather told me of such things. When the herd faced peril, one might be sent to seek help, not to be tamed, not to be owned, but to call a man to listen." Caleb let out a short laugh, more to cover his unease than out of disbelief. "Jonah, I've mended fences all my life. Horses don't send messages. They graze, they roam, they keep clear of us." He tried to sound certain, but his own words rang thin. Jonah's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "You can dismiss the story if you want, but that mare looks at you as if she knows you, as if she's asking." He paused, then added, And sometimes ignoring such a call brings its own kind of trouble. The weight of the words pressed heavier than Caleb expected. He swallowed, his throat dry. The mare still hadn't moved. Rainwater glistened on her coat, turning her body into a living sculpture against the pale sky. The image clung to him long after Jonah climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving only dust and the fading hum of the engine. Caleb spent the rest of the morning working the south field, but his focus was scattered. He loaded hay bales, repaired a hinge on the barn door, checked water troughs, all routine tasks, yet his mind kept circling back to Jonah's story. Could a wild horse truly be seeking him out? Each time he glanced toward the ridge, he half expected to see her still standing there. By noon, the ridge was empty. Later, when he drove into town for supplies, he hoped the noise of Rock Springs might quiet his thoughts. The feed store smelled of alfalfa and oil, shelves stacked with sacks of grain, ropes, and work gloves. Mary, who ran the counter, raised a brow at his distracted air. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked. Caleb only muttered about the storm damage and paid for what he needed. But as he carried the bags to his truck, he caught himself scanning the empty parking lot, searching for a flicker of gray. On the way home, the sky widened again, endless and merciless. He slowed his truck near the basin where mustangs sometimes grazed. His eyes scanned the rolling land, the scrub brush, the dry cuts of earth. And then he saw her. The gray mare stood alone, not grazing, not running, watching. When his truck idled, she tossed her head toward the north again, the same deliberate motion as before. Caleb's stomach tightened. He cut the engine. For a long while, neither moved. The wind stirred, whistling across the plain. Then, with a soundless decision, the mare turned and trotted toward the ridge. Not fast, not fleeing. She moved with a steady rhythm, pausing now and then to look back. The message was unmistakable. Follow. Caleb gripped the wheel, torn. Logic told him to drive home. There was still work to do, bills to pay, a farm to hold together by thin threads. But something deeper, something raw and unexplainable, pulled at him. His hands trembled against the steering column. He thought of Jonah's warning. Sometimes ignoring a call brings its own kind of trouble. Instead of following, Caleb drove home, but his chest carried a restless ache. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open once again, his pen hovered above the page. He had filled it for years with rainfall, soil reports, and livestock counts, facts, plain and grounding. But now he wrote a line that shook him as soon as he saw it. "She wants me to go north." He stared at the words, unable to cross them out. The ink seemed heavier than usual, anchoring the page. A sharp pang ran through him, the old ache of loss he rarely allowed to surface. His ex-wife had once told him he was too rigid, too unwilling to hear the unspoken. Perhaps she had been right. Perhaps that was why he stood alone now. The house settled with groans in the beams. Outside, coyotes called across the open land. Caleb pressed the pen down again, slower this time. If I don't follow, what am I refusing? He closed the notebook, but the question clung to the edges of his mind. In the quiet hours before dawn, Caleb stepped outside to breathe the cold air. The horizon was faint with light, the sky streaked pale. His breath curled white in the dark. And then, from the ridge, He heard it, a sound sharp and carrying, the distinct whinny of a horse slicing across the stillness. He turned, his pulse racing. The gray mare's silhouette was etched once more against the rising sun. She did not move toward him. Instead, she stood perfectly still, waiting. And in that fragile dawn, Caleb felt the certainty he had resisted harden into truth. The mare wasn't leaving. She wasn't wandering. She was calling him north, and the time for ignoring had passed. The first light of Saturday stretched across the farm, brushing the barns with pale gold. Caleb Brooks had already finished his coffee when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Few people ever came uninvited. He stepped out to the porch, expecting maybe a delivery truck, but instead saw an unfamiliar sedan pulling into the yard. A woman climbed out, then waved as a younger figure followed, clutching a small backpack. "Mr. Brooks?" the woman called, approaching with a firm but cautious stride. "I'm Helen Alvarez, from the County Foster Program. We spoke on the phone about some work for my niece." Caleb searched his memory, then recalled the brief conversation weeks ago. He had agreed to let a teenager earn a few dollars helping around the farm. He hadn't expected her so soon, and certainly not today, when his mind was still heavy with the image of the gray mare. The girl who stepped forward looked younger than 16, her dark hair falling loose, her gaze flickering quick and wary. She adjusted the strap of her bag, then glanced at the pasture, as though measuring the distance to the horizon. "This is June," Helen said. "She'll just be here on weekends. She loves animals. I thought it'd do her good to be outdoors." Caleb nodded stiffly, uncertain. He wasn't used to company, least of all the kind that carried more silence than words. "Work's not glamorous," he muttered, "but if she doesn't mind hay dust and sore hands, there's plenty to do." June managed a small smile. "I don't mind." Her voice was soft, yet it carried an edge of determination, like she had learned to hold her own silence close. Helen left soon after, and Caleb found himself alone with the girl. He showed her the barn, the feed storage, the water troughs. She moved carefully, her hands lingering on the wooden beams as though testing the place for trust. When she brushed her fingers against the flank of an old cow, she whispered something too low for him to catch, and the animal stood oddly still, as if soothed. Later that morning, as they carried buckets across the yard, June stopped suddenly. Her eyes had caught movement on the ridge. Caleb followed her gaze and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The gray mare. She stood farther out than before, but visible, her silhouette etched against the pale sky. "You didn't say you had horses," June murmured, eyes wide. "I don't," Caleb replied. "That one's wild." June tilted her head, studying the animal. "She's not just standing there. She's watching." The words struck him harder than he expected. He had thought the same, but hearing it spoken by someone else, especially by this quiet girl, made it more real. He didn't answer, only lifted the bucket again. But June lingered, her gaze locked on the mare. At midday, they worked in silence, the sound of water sloshing, chickens rustling in the yard. Then, while they rested near the barn, June asked abruptly, "Why is she here?" Caleb hesitated, then shook his head. "Don't know." He wanted to say more, but couldn't find words that made sense. June leaned her chin on her knees, watching the horizon. "Maybe she wants you to follow." The remark chilled him. Jonah had said nearly the same thing. He studied the girl, wondering how she could see what even he resisted. That evening, as the sun dipped, June stood by the fence, still staring toward the ridge. The mare had drawn nearer, closer than Caleb had ever seen in daylight. June lifted her hand in a slow, cautious gesture. To his astonishment, the mare flicked her ears and stepped forward, one pace, then two, before halting. Caleb's heart thudded. He felt the moment stretch, delicate as spun glass. The wind carried the scent of sage, the air buzzing with silence. June whispered, almost reverent, "She's not afraid of us." Caleb wanted to deny it, but the evidence stood right there, shimmering in the dusk. The mare's eyes, dark and steady, rested on him as though she carried a message only he could answer. He gripped the fence rail, the wood rough beneath his palm, and for the first time allowed himself to wonder. Maybe the wild had chosen him after all. Night came slow, shadows stretching across the yard. June said little at supper, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, searching the dark beyond. Caleb didn't ask what she was thinking. He didn't need to. He already knew. The gray mare had unsettled more than just him. When June finally settled into the guest room, Caleb lingered on the porch, notebook in hand. He wrote his usual notes about feed and weather, but at the bottom of the page he added, almost against his will, "June saw her too." Mare came closer, almost touched. He closed the notebook, his chest heavy. The silence of the plains no longer belonged only to him. And for the first time in years, he felt the strange weight of expectation. Not from people, not from the land, but from something untamed, watching in the distance, waiting for him to listen. The next morning rose pale and brittle, the air crisp after a night of restless winds. Caleb found June already outside, standing near the fence line with her jacket pulled tight, eyes locked on the ridge. He followed her gaze, and sure enough, the gray mare was there again, closer than before, her coat silvered by the dawn light. June whispered without turning, "She waited all night." The certainty in her tone unsettled him. Caleb carried a bucket to the trough, forcing himself to focus on the ordinary rhythm of chores. Yet he felt the mare's presence pressing against his back, heavy as a hand. When he finally allowed himself to look again, something new caught his eye. The mare's mane shifted in the breeze, revealing a small knot, woven tight, almost deliberate. At first he thought it might be burrs, but no, the strands were twined together in a pattern too clean to be random. He narrowed his eyes. "June," he murmured, "you see that?" June stepped closer to the fence, squinting. "It's braided," she said simply. Her voice trembled with awe. The idea made Caleb uneasy. Wild horses didn't braid their own manes, and no rancher had been near enough to do it. The knot was small, but it carried weight, like a sign left behind without explanation. He rubbed his jaw, unsettled. The mare pawed the ground once, then lifted her head toward the northern basin, the same gesture she had made before. Before Caleb could process it further, the sound of a truck approached. A white government vehicle rolled into the yard, dust trailing behind. Dana Short, a ranger with the Bureau of Land Management, stepped out, adjusting her hat. She was a woman of sharp edges and measured words, known across the county for her strict adherence to regulation. "Morning, Brooks," she called. Her eyes swept the horizon, then landed on the mare. A frown deepened across her face. "You've had company, I see." Caleb felt June stiffen beside him. He forced his tone calm. "She's wild, just passing through." Dana's gaze lingered. Mustangs don't pass through like that. They keep their distance. If she's hanging around, it'll raise questions. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Don't feed her. Don't shelter her. You know the law. It's illegal to harbor wild stock. Caleb bristled. I haven't done anything. See that you don't? Dana said. She turned to leave, but paused, eyes narrowing at the mare's mane. Strange, she muttered, almost to herself. That knot. Never seen one quite like it. Then she shook her head, climbing back into the truck. Be careful, Brooks. Curiosity can cost more than you're willing to pay. The vehicle rumbled away, leaving silence heavy in its wake. Caleb felt the warning settle like grit in his teeth. June, however, looked more curious than afraid. Why would her mane be braided? No one's been near enough. Caleb didn't answer. The question churned inside him like storm water against a dam. He busied himself with chores, but every glance toward the ridge pulled his mind back to that knot, that deliberate sign. By afternoon, clouds gathered low and heavy, a dull gray pressing down on the plains. Caleb worked, along the north pasture fence, hammer in hand. June followed with a coil of wire, her boots crunching on the gravel. They spoke little, but when a sudden gust rattled the posts, Caleb looked up and froze. The mare had moved closer again, standing no more than 30 yards away. Her eyes locked on his, unblinking. The knot in her mane swayed like a signal flag. She pawed once at the earth, then tossed her head northward again. Caleb's grip tightened on the hammer. The message was insistent, impossible to ignore. June whispered, She's telling us to follow. Caleb shook his head, throat tight. She's a horse, June. That's all. But even as he said it, the words tasted hollow. As dusk fell, the wind carried a scent Caleb couldn't place. Sharp, mineral, almost metallic. It clung to the air like a warning. He and June stood at the fence as the last light faded, watching the mare linger near the basin. The knot in her mane caught the final glow of sunset, glinting like a mark left by unseen hands. Back at the farmhouse, Caleb opened his notebook again. His writing was rough, uneven. Mare still here. Knot in mane. Ranger noticed. Warning given. He stared at the page until the ink blurred. The rules of his world, cattle counts, rainfall, soil notes, felt suddenly fragile. Something larger pressed against the edges, something wild and insistent, written not in numbers, but in the dark eyes of a gray mare. That night, long after June had gone to bed, Caleb stood by the porch. The plains stretched vast and silent, stars pricking the sky. And there, faint against the darkness, the mare's silhouette lingered once more, unmoving, waiting. The braid in her mane caught the moonlight like a secret he was being asked to carry. He exhaled, slow and weary, knowing deep down that ignoring her was no longer possible. Whatever she bore, whatever message that knot carried, it was meant for him. The morning broke with a thin veil of mist lying low over the pasture, a pale blanket that blurred the fences and softened the edges of the barns. Caleb Brooks tightened the strap on his gloves, trying to clear his head with work. Yet no matter how many bales he stacked, no matter how steady he kept his rhythm, his eyes drifted again and again to the ridge. The gray mare was there. Ash, as he had started to call her in the privacy of his own mind. She did not graze or wander. She faced the north, her body taut as if pulled by some invisible thread. Caleb's chest tightened. He had learned to live by rules, Keep the land, feed the stock, pay the bills. But this horse was unraveling all of that, asking him to listen to something beyond routine. June emerged from the barn, hair pulled into a messy braid, her cheeks flushed from early chores. She followed his gaze instantly. "She's waiting for us," she said, voice certain, as though it were obvious. Caleb frowned. "She's wild. Waiting isn't something wild horses do." June shook her head. "Then, why hasn't she left?" The question hung in the air, heavy as a storm cloud. Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the tool bag and started toward the north fence. June trailed beside him, her steps quick to match his. By mid-morning, they reached the far pasture, where the land broke open into rolling sagebrush. That was when Ash moved. She trotted a few paces ahead, stopped, and turned back to look at them. Her ears flicked, her eyes fixed. Caleb slowed, his breath catching. The mare tossed her head toward the basin, then took another step forward. "She wants us to follow," June whispered. Caleb gritted his teeth, unwilling to admit it, but unable to deny what he saw. The mare repeated the pattern. Move forward. Pause. Glance back. The rhythm was deliberate, insistent. For over an hour, the strange procession continued. Caleb and June walking the fence line, Ash pacing parallel just beyond, her path angling steadily north. The wind carried a new scent, sharp, mineral, tinged with salt. Caleb recognized it with unease. The basin was near, the place where water once pooled in heavy rains and left behind flats of cracked white earth. Few ranchers went that way. The ground was treacherous, riddled with sinkholes and hidden gullies. By noon, sweat dampened Caleb's shirt. He stopped at a rise, pulling off his hat to wipe his brow. Ash stood below, her sides heaving, her eyes never leaving his. She pawed once at the ground, then swung her head sharply toward the basin, ears pinned with urgency. June's voice came soft but steady. "She's leading us somewhere." Caleb looked down at her. The girl's face was earnest, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. He wanted to tell her to forget it, to turn back, to keep to the safety of chores and fences. But then he remembered the knot in the mare's mane, the deliberate braid that no hand of his had made. He remembered Jonah's words. Sometimes a horse doesn't just wander. "All right," he muttered, his voice rough. "We'll go a little farther." Ash responded instantly, surging forward with a low whinny that carried across the wind. She moved with a pace both urgent and careful, as though she knew the land's hidden dangers. Caleb and June followed along the outer fence, watching her weave between gullies, skirt patches of loose soil, pause at points where the ground seemed uncertain. When they reached the lip of the basin, the air changed. It smelled of damp earth, though no rain had fallen in days. The silence was sharper here, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Caleb's boots crunched on the brittle crust, each step echoing in the hollow. Ash stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine, her body rigid, her nostrils flaring. She stamped the ground once, twice, the sound dull against the earth. June clutched Caleb's sleeve. "Listen." At first he heard nothing but the wind. Then, faint and muffled, came a sound that didn't belong. A weak, rasping cry. It rose, broke, then faded, like the last effort of something small and fragile. Caleb's heart lurched. He leaned closer to the ravine. eyes narrowing. Shadows hid the bottom, but movement flickered below, a trembling shape barely visible. Ash whinnied sharply, her body tense with urgency. June gasped. "There's something down there." Caleb's pulse hammered. He knew now. This was why she had come, why she had followed, why she had waited. She wasn't lost. She was leading him. For a long moment, he stood frozen, the truth pressing down like the weight of the entire plane. Then, slowly, he exhaled. His eyes met Ash's across the distance. She pawed once more, the braid in her mane swaying like a signal in the wind. Whatever lay in that ravine, she had brought him here to see it. And Caleb knew, with a certainty that rattled his bones, that turning back was no longer an option. The sound came again, fragile yet piercing, echoing from the hollow below. Caleb Brooks gripped the edge of the ravine, leaning forward until gravel slipped under his boots. June Alvarez knelt beside him, her breath quick, her eyes wide. The cry wasn't the call of any bird, nor the bark of a coyote. It was thinner, weaker, like the desperate voice of something not meant to be alone. Ash stood above them, tense as a bowstring. Her nostrils flared, her body quivering, each breath a rough whisper. She pawed the ground with such force that dust rose in small clouds. Caleb's eyes strained against the shadow. Then he saw it, a trembling shape at the bottom, legs spindly, chest heaving, a foal. Its coat was darkened with mud, ribs jutting sharp, its small head lifting in broken rhythm before collapsing again. June gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's a baby." Her voice cracked, raw. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had seen sick calves, the weak left behind by the herd. But this was different. This foal had not been abandoned by chance. Its eyes, hollow, clouded with exhaustion, lifted toward the lip of the ravine where Ash stood. And Ash answered, a sharp, guttural whinny that rattled across the basin. The truth seared through Caleb. This was her foal. His chest tightened. No wonder she had followed him, waited, pleaded with those deliberate gestures. She hadn't chosen him out of curiosity. She had chosen him because she had no other way. June's voice trembled. "We have to help it." Caleb's gaze swept the ravine. The sides were steep, clay slick with hidden moisture. One wrong step, and the whole slope could give way. He clenched his jaw, cursing under his breath. "It's not that simple." June turned to him, her face pale, but determined. "If we don't, it will die." The words struck with brutal clarity. He looked back at the foal. Its legs flailed weakly, its body trembling with every shallow breath. The air around it shimmered faintly with the smell of damp soil and something sharper, like rust. Caleb recognized it with dread. The seep of water through clay. If the basin filled, the foal wouldn't last an hour. Ash gave another cry, lower this time, a sound that dug deep into Caleb's chest. She paced along the rim, eyes wild with desperation, her head jerking toward him as though commanding action. Caleb felt the weight of choice pressing on him like a physical burden. He thought of Dana Short's warning only yesterday. Do not interfere. He thought of fines, the law, the way men could lose everything in a heartbeat if they broke rules carved in statute. He thought of his farm, fragile as it already was, held together by sweat and debt. But then he thought of the hollow eyes of the foal, and of Ash, who had carried herself across miles of dangerous land to stand before him. She had asked for nothing else but this. Caleb clenched his fists. "Stay back," he told June, his voice hard but unsteady. He slid down onto his knees, testing the ground. Loose clay shifted, threatening to crumble. The slope was too steep to climb with his weight. He cursed again, scanning for rope, for anything. He had left the truck a mile back. No tools, no equipment. Nothing but his own hands. June pressed forward, her voice fierce. "We can use my jacket. Twist it. Make a rope." Caleb blinked, startled by her quick thinking. He nodded once, sharp. Together, they stripped her jacket, twisting it with his belt into a crude line. Caleb anchored one end around a sagebrush root, then wrapped the other around his forearm. "Hold the base," he ordered. The descent was clumsy, the ground crumbling under each step. Dirt slid into his boots, dust stung his eyes, and the air grew thick. The foal flinched at his approach, a thin cry tearing from its throat. Caleb's voice softened. "Easy, little one. Easy now." His own words sounded foreign, fragile in the hollow. He crouched low, reaching slowly. The foal's hide was hot, trembling beneath a coat caked with mud. Its heartbeat thrummed wild beneath his palm. He slid his arms under its chest, lifting carefully. The weight was more than he expected, deadened by weakness. The foal let out a sound that pierced him deeper than any cry he had ever heard. Not fear, but surrender. Above, June's voice called out, urgent. "The ground's giving way! Hurry!" Caleb tightened his grip, muscles burning. He planted his boots and pushed upward, his shoulder straining as clumps of clay broke loose. The crude rope cut into his arm, but he heaved with everything he had left. The foal struggled once, then went limp against him. At the rim, Ash screamed, a wild, desperate cry that echoed like thunder across the basin. The mare pawed and circled, her body frantic. Caleb surged one last time, his knees scraping raw, and collapsed onto the edge. June scrambled to grab the foal's hindquarters, hauling with all her might. Together, gasping, they pulled it onto solid ground. Ash rushed forward, her muzzle pressing against the foal's side, nipping, urging. The foal stirred faintly, its eyes flickering open. Caleb rolled onto his back, chest heaving, the sky spinning above him. He could smell the salt of sweat, the iron tang of blood where his forearm had been scraped raw. But all of it faded as he turned his head and saw Ash lower her face to the foal, breathing life into it with every frantic touch. June knelt beside them, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "You did it," she whispered. Caleb shook his head. His voice came hoarse. "No, she did. I just listened." The foal gave a weak, broken whinny that carried across the basin. Ash answered instantly, her sound fierce and trembling with relief. Caleb felt the world tilt in that moment, something breaking open in him he hadn't realized was locked shut. Above, clouds gathered, casting the basin in shifting shadow. The three of them, man, girl, and mare, stood around the fragile body of a foal that should not have survived, yet still breathed. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt that maybe he too had been pulled back from the edge. The foal lay curled in the straw-colored dust at the rim of the ravine, its body shuddering with each breath. Ash hovered over it, nudging, urging, her cries raw and guttural. Caleb Brooks knelt nearby, his forearm bleeding where clay and stone had torn skin. June sat cross-legged, still trembling from the rescue, her eyes fixed on the fragile creature between them. For a long stretch of silence, no one spoke. Only the sound of wind sweeping across the basin and Ash's desperate snorts filled the air. Caleb had known moments of risk before, blizzards swallowing cattle, droughts that emptied wells, but this felt different. This wasn't survival measured in numbers and stock reports. This was a life placed into his hands, a decision heavier than land deeds or debts. The foal stirred weakly, one spindly leg kicking at the air. June leaned closer, whispering encouragement as though words might anchor it to the world. "You can do it. You're safe now." Her voice cracked, trembling with belief. Caleb's gaze drifted to Ash. Her dark eyes met his, filled with a wild intensity that seemed to pierce through bone. He thought of Jonah's tale, of a horse sent as a messenger. Maybe this was it. Maybe she had chosen him not because he was worthy, but because there was no one else. He sat back heavily, dust clinging to his sweat-soaked shirt. The reality came crashing in. The Bureau of Land Management's rules were clear. Wild horses were not to be interfered with, not to be sheltered, not to be claimed. Dana Short's warning echoed in his mind. Don't feed her. Don't shelter her. Curiosity can cost more than you're willing to pay. Yet here he was, the foal's hot breath dampening his palm. June broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Caleb hesitated, his voice low, rough. "If we leave it here, it won't last the night." "Then we can't leave. It's not that simple." He rubbed his face with his good hand, grit grinding against skin. "The law—" June cut him off, her eyes fierce. "The law doesn't hear cries like that. You do." Her words struck him like a blow. He looked at the foal again, ribs rising in shallow rhythm. It was too weak to stand, its body trembling with exhaustion. Ash nuzzled it, desperate but gentle, then turned her head sharply toward Caleb, as if demanding his answer. He exhaled, long and heavy, the decision crystallizing inside him. He thought of his failed marriage, of all the times he had chosen silence over action, routine over risk. He remembered the emptiness of nights when the farmhouse echoed too loudly, when even the notebook filled with weather reports could not steady him. He had lived by rules, and those rules had left him alone. This time, he could not walk away. Caleb pulled the rope he'd used for the descent from his belt, twisting it between his hands. "We'll get it out of here proper. Then—" his voice faltered, but his resolve hardened. "Then I'll take it back. We'll figure it out there." June's face lit with relief, though her eyes glistened with tears. She reached out to steady the foal's neck as Caleb prepared to lift again. Together, with Ash pacing frantic circles around them, they maneuvered the small body onto a makeshift sling of canvas and rope. The walk back to the farm felt endless. Caleb carried the heavier load, June steadying the foal's legs. Ash followed close, her presence like a shadow against his shoulder. The sun dipped lower, painting the basin in rust and gold. Each step pressed the weight of risk deeper into his bones, fines, suspicion, the possibility of losing everything he had left. Yet beneath it, another weight stirred, one that felt strangely lighter. Responsibility, yes, but also purpose. By the time they reached the yard, sweat streamed down Caleb's face, his muscles screaming. He eased the foal down onto a bed of straw inside the old storage shed. The smell of dust and rusting tools hung heavy, but it was shelter, at least for tonight. June fetched a bucket of water while Caleb checked the foal's breathing. Its chest rose, weak but steady. Ash stood just outside the doorway, her ears flicking, her body tense. She did not enter, but her gaze never wavered from her young. Caleb straightened slowly, meeting those eyes. "I couldn't leave him," he muttered, the words half to her, half to himself. For a moment, Ash stilled, her breath visible in the fading light. Then she lowered her head in a small, deliberate motion, as though acknowledging his choice. Caleb felt the gesture carve deep inside him, binding him to a path from which there was no turning back. Later, when the sky darkened and June finally fell asleep on a pile of blankets in the corner, Caleb remained awake. He sat on a wooden crate, notebook open on his knee. The ink trembled under his hand as he wrote, "Foal rescued, weak, breathing. Against the law, but couldn't walk away." He paused, staring at the page. Then, with a hand that didn't shake this time, he added, "Sometimes the right thing isn't the legal thing." Outside, Ash whinnied softly, the sound low and haunting in the night air. Caleb closed the notebook, resting his hand on its cover. He had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. But as he looked at the fragile life curled on the straw, he knew there was no regret. Only the weight of choice, and the strange, unexpected peace that came with it. The shed smelled of rust and old wood, a place where forgotten tools had been left to gather dust. Now it held something fragile, something that did not belong to silence and cobwebs. A foal stretched on a bed of straw, its sides rising and falling with shallow rhythm. Caleb Brooks knelt nearby, sleeves rolled past his elbows, his scraped arm wrapped with a strip of cloth. The day's labor still ached in his muscles, but his eyes never left the small creature before him. Ash stood just beyond the doorway, framed by the dim light. She would not enter, yet every movement of her ears, every flicker of her dark eyes was tethered to the foal. At times she stamped the ground softly, as though impatience alone might give strength back to her young. Each sound from the foal, every thin exhale, every faint twitch pulled her forward, but the threshold between wild and human held her back. June Alvarez sat cross-legged against the wall, her hair loose around her face, watching with the intensity of someone who understood too much too soon. She dipped a rag into a bucket of water and wrung it carefully, whispering as she dabbed the foal's muzzle. "He's thirsty, but he's too weak." Caleb reached into the small sack he had brought from the pantry. Powdered milk replacer, meant for calves. He mixed it with warm water in a battered tin pail, then poured some into a glass bottle fitted with a rubber nipple. He turned the bottle in his hand, doubtful. "I don't know if he'll take it." "Try," June urged, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He held the bottle near the foal's mouth. At first there was nothing, only shallow breaths, the faint flare of nostrils. Then, slowly, the lips twitched. A weak tongue brushed the rubber, and a tentative suckle followed. The sound was so faint Caleb almost missed it, but when he realized, his chest tightened. Relief came like a tide he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. "He's drinking," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. June leaned forward, her eyes shining. "See? He wants to live." They fed him in intervals, a few gulps at a time. Each pause left Caleb holding his breath, waiting to see if the foal would give up. But each time, it returned. Clumsy, but determined. By the second feeding, its breaths had steadied. Caleb sat back against the wall, sweat damp on his brow, his body aching yet lighter. He found himself whispering, "That's it, little one. Stay with us." The hours passed slow. June dozed against the straw, her hand still resting near the foal's flank. Outside, Ash kept vigil, her silhouette moving in restless arcs against the pale wash of moonlight. Caleb listened to the steady rhythm of the foal's breathing, the occasional creak of the shed, the wind brushing against loose boards. It was the music of survival, fragile but real. Toward dawn, a thin sound pierced the stillness. A whinny, rasping, cracked, yet undeniably a call. The foal's head lifted slightly, its ears twitching, voice scraping the air. Ash answered instantly from the doorway, her cry fierce and trembling. Caleb's throat closed. This was the first time the foal had spoken since he had seen it in the ravine. He looked at June, who was awake now, her face streaked with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "He called back," she whispered. Caleb nodded slowly, his chest heavy. "Yeah, he did." When the sun finally broke over the ridge, the shed glowed with amber light. Dust motes drifted in golden shafts, and for a fleeting moment the scene felt otherworldly. A wild mare at the threshold, her foal finding its voice again, and a weary man who had once believed himself emptied of purpose, now bound by something as fragile as breath. Later that morning, as Caleb stepped outside to wash his hands at the pump, he caught sight of a figure on the road. A man on a bicycle slowed, eyes scanning the yard, then lingered on the shed. He offered a polite nod before pedaling away, but Caleb's gut tightened. Strangers rarely paid attention to his farm. If word spread, if questions were asked, Dana Short's warning echoed fresh in his mind. Inside the shed, June stroked the foal's mane gently. "What will we call him?" she asked. Caleb hesitated, looking at the small body shifting against the straw. He thought of sparks striking stone, fragile yet fierce, a flame born in the dark. "Flint," he said finally. "Strong enough to start a fire." June smiled faintly, repeating the name under her breath. The foal stirred, as if recognizing the sound. Caleb stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Ash press close, her eyes never leaving them. The choice he had made weighed heavy, but for the first time in years, the weight felt worth carrying. By the time the second week unfolded, the shed no longer smelled of rust alone. It carried the earthy sweetness of fresh straw, the faint musk of a growing foal, and the lingering presence of a wild mare who refused to leave the yard. Flint, though still thin, had begun to rise shakily to his feet, testing legs that wobbled like saplings in wind. Each step was an uncertain promise, but Caleb Brooks felt something unclench inside him each time the foal stood and did not fall. June Alvarez spent her afternoons perched on a bale of hay, reading homework assignments aloud to the foal as if sound itself might weave strength into him. Flint listened with ears flicking, sometimes nudging her hand for attention. Ash hovered nearby, never crossing into the shed but circling it like a moon bound to its orbit. Each low nicker she gave seemed to answer her foal's tentative calls. For Caleb, the days blurred into a rhythm he had not known since his younger years, feeding on a schedule, recording Flint's weight in his notebook, counting ounces of milk replacer consumed. What surprised him most was the way June had slipped seamlessly into this rhythm. She measured water carefully, adjusted straw when Flint stumbled, and laughed softly when his clumsy hooves scattered buckets. Her laughter had been rare when she arrived. Now it filled the shed like sunlight where dust motes swirled. But shadows gathered in other places. One afternoon, while Caleb was unloading supplies from the truck, he noticed a car idling longer than it should on the county road. A window rolled down, a camera lens glinted briefly. Then the vehicle pulled away. His gut tightened. He had lived long enough to know how quickly whispers traveled in small towns. That evening, June asked what worried him. Caleb hesitated, then admitted, "If folks think I'm keeping a wild horse, there'll be questions I can't answer." He left unsaid the fines, the confiscation, the loss of all they had fought to give Flint. June's face darkened, her hand stroking Flint's mane protectively. "Then we keep him quiet. People don't need to know." But already, people were noticing. Riley Park, a podcaster known for chasing stories about life on the range, had heard rumors. He recorded an episode with a voice full of intrigue. "There's talk of a farmer out near the basin who's got a shadow. A wild mare that won't leave, and something else. Something she brought with her. Folks say a foal. If it's true, it's not just unusual. It's extraordinary." The podcast spread across local feeds, drawing curiosity like moths to flame. Caleb learned of it 3 days later, when Mary at the feed store mentioned it in passing. "Heard Riley talking about some wild horse choosing a man. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it?" she said with a chuckle, handing him a sack of oats. Caleb forced a nod, but inside, dread coiled. He drove home with his jaw clenched, the radio silent, the road stretching endless under a sky too wide to offer comfort. Back at the shed, Flint greeted him with a shaky trot, his eyes brighter now, his whinny clearer. Caleb knelt, pressing his hand to the foal's warm neck. He whispered, almost to himself, "You're tougher than you look." Flint nuzzled his shoulder in answer, and for a moment, the noise of the outside world faded. That night, June suggested giving Flint a proper name. Caleb raised a brow. "Flint isn't proper?" "It's strong," she admitted, "but it's what you chose. He should know who he is when we call him. He deserves more than survival. He deserves to belong." Her words struck deep. Caleb had named cattle by numbers, horses by practicality, dogs by habit. But this was different. This foal was no ledger entry. He looked at the small creature dozing against straw, his breathing steady, his chest rising with a rhythm that had nearly been stolen. Slowly, Caleb nodded. "Lucky," he said at last. "He's lucky, because against all odds, he is." June smiled through the dim lantern light. She leaned close to whisper it. "Lucky." The foal stirred, ears twitching at the sound. Ash answered with a low, rolling nicker from outside, as though acknowledging the truth of it. From then on, the name held. Each time Caleb stepped into the shed, he called it softly, and each time the foal lifted his head, eyes brightening with recognition. The bond tightened, weaving them together into something neither law nor rumor could easily undo. But beyond the farm, whispers grew louder. The podcast spread, stories bent and twisted. Some praised Caleb's supposed compassion. Others condemned him for breaking rules. The tale had already slipped beyond his control, carried on voices he could not silence. One night, sitting alone with his notebook, Caleb wrote, "He is lucky, but luck can turn fast when men and laws catch wind." He closed the book, the lantern flickering. Outside, Ash shifted, her dark eyes reflecting the dim glow. Caleb exhaled, heavy and uncertain. He had given the foal a name. Now he had to decide how far he was willing to go to keep it alive. By late October, the chill had sharpened across the plains, a bite in the morning air that made each breath sting. Caleb Brooks pulled his collar high as he walked from the truck to the feed store, his steps heavy with more than cold. Whispers had been building. He could feel them long before Mary's raised eyebrow or the sideways glance of men loitering by the sacks of grain. News traveled fast in places like Rock Springs, too fast for a man who valued silence. Inside the store, the smell of alfalfa mixed with the metallic tang of nails and the sweet dust of grain. Mary rang up his salt blocks without a word, but when she slid the receipt across, she leaned closer. "You've got folks talking, Caleb." His jaw tightened. "About what?" She gave a half smile that wasn't amusement. "About shadows on your land. About a foal where there shouldn't be one. Riley Park's podcast is all over town. He made it sound like a legend, the wild mare who chose a farmer. Some people are charmed. Others are calling for BLM to check your place." Caleb's hand paused on the paper, then tightened until it crumpled slightly. He forced a nod, slid the receipt into his pocket, and left without another word. Outside, the wind pushed dust across the lot. His eyes flicked to the far hills, where no one else was looking. But he knew what waited there. Ash, pacing near the fence line. Lucky never far from her side. At the farm, June was in the shed, her voice low and steady as she coaxed Lucky to nurse from the bottle. The foal had grown stronger, his legs steadier, his eyes brighter with each passing day. He nickered when Caleb stepped through the doorway, the sound warm, like recognition. June grinned, holding the bottle steady. "He's hungry today. That's good." Caleb managed a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He crouched beside them, running a hand down Lucky's neck. The foal leaned into the touch, and for a moment the world narrowed. No rumors, no laws, only the steady beat of life, where once there had been only silence. But later, while fixing a gate, Caleb heard tires crunching on the gravel road. He straightened, his body taut. A pickup slowed near his drive, two men inside leaning to look across the yard. The truck didn't stop, only rolled past, but the weight of their stares lingered. Caleb exhaled, muttered a curse under his breath. That evening, Jonah Blackbear stopped by, his presence steady as the land itself. He leaned on the porch rail, his lined face calm, but his eyes sharp. "You've stirred the wind, Caleb," he said. "I didn't ask for it." "No," Jonah agreed. "But the mare did. And now people want to see what she asked you to carry." Caleb's shoulders sagged. "They'll take him if they find out." Jonah's gaze drifted toward the shed, where the glow of a lantern flickered. "The world writes laws to keep order. But the old ways? They write laws to keep life. You'll have to decide which set you belong to." That night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, notebook open. His hand moved slow across the page. Rumors spreading, cars slowing, eyes watching, Lucky growing stronger. Each day is a gift, but each day is a risk. The lantern hissed softly. Outside, Lucky gave a high, clear whinny, and Ash answered from the dark. The sound echoed like a promise and a warning. The following morning, June brought the local paper inside. Someone had left it folded on the porch. A headline caught Caleb's eye. "Whispers of a wild rescue. Is a local farmer harboring mustangs?" His stomach knotted as he read, the words painting him as both hero and outlaw, a man defying federal oversight. He set the paper down with a force that rattled the table. June's voice was quiet. "They're coming, aren't they?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth sat heavy in the silence. Lucky pressed his muzzle into Caleb's palm later that day, warm and insistent. Caleb closed his eyes, his throat tight. "I won't let them take you," he whispered. But even as he said it, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed in his mind, a sound he knew would return sooner or later. For now, though, the foal was alive, and that was enough to fight for. Caleb squared his shoulders, the weight of the plains pressing against him. The law might be closing in, but so was something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The frost lay heavy across the pasture that morning, each blade of grass silvered, the earth crisp beneath boots. Caleb Brooks moved slowly, his breath steaming in the pale light. Lucky trotted clumsily inside the shed's small paddock, his legs stronger now, his whinny clearer each day. Ash shadowed him faithfully, pacing the fence like a guardian spirit. The sight should have eased Caleb's heart, yet the weight on his chest only deepened. Rumors had swollen into something harder, something that pressed at the edges of his land like wolves testing a fence. He heard it in town. Whispers at the cafe, pauses in conversation when he entered. Riley Park's podcast had reached more ears than he'd guessed, and the local paper's headline had given it new teeth. He felt the gaze of strangers in the hardware store, suspicion carried in silence. Each time a vehicle slowed on the gravel road near his gate, his pulse hammered. That morning, a new truck pulled into the yard, not government-issued white, but dark green, with a vet's insignia painted faintly on the door. Out stepped Maya Ellison, tall, lean, her jacket weathered by years of field work. She carried a satchel slung over one shoulder, her stride brisk, her eyes sharp and unafraid. Caleb bristled at first, another intrusion, but she raised a hand in greeting. "Jonah sent me," she said before he could speak. "Said you might need help." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for it." "No," Maya replied calmly, "but the mare did. And if that foal's to survive, you'll want more than luck and milk replacer." Her gaze flicked past him toward the shed. Lucky had stuck his head out of the open slat, ears flicking curiously, muzzle damp with milk. Behind him, Ash loomed, nostrils flaring at the stranger's scent. Maya softened her stance, lowering her voice as though addressing them both. "Easy, girl. I'm here to help, not harm." Caleb studied her, mistrust battling with the gnawing truth. He needed expertise. Lucky had survived weeks, yes, but survival was not the same as thriving. He stepped aside with a gruff nod. "Don't spook her." Inside, the shed smelled of straw and warmth. Maya knelt slowly, pulling a stethoscope from her bag. She extended her hand palm down, letting Lucky sniff. The foal's ears twitched, but when Caleb moved closer, laying his hand reassuringly on Lucky's neck, the young horse stilled. Only then did Maya lean in, placing the cold disc against his chest. She listened, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Heart strong," she murmured. She checked lungs, joints, teeth, Each observation she recorded neatly in a small notebook. June hovered nearby, eyes wide, absorbing every movement. "He's underweight, but improving," Maya said at last. "Respiration's shallow, but that's expected. You've done well." Caleb exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders. The words struck deeper than he expected. "You've done well." For weeks, he had braced himself against failure, against the constant fear of losing the foal despite his effort. Hearing validation cracked something in him, leaving behind both relief and dread, because if Lucky was healthy, then Lucky was also worth taking. June broke the moment with a question. "What about the braid in Ash's mane? Have you ever seen that before?" Maya's eyes sharpened. She stepped to the doorway, studying the mare from a distance. Ash tossed her head, the knot swaying like a signal. "Not man-made," Maya murmured. "I've read of such things, herd behavior. Sometimes others weave strands when driving one out to seek help. Rare, but not unheard of." Caleb frowned. "You're saying the herd sent her?" "I'm saying the evidence points that way," Maya replied. She scribbled notes quickly. "This isn't just survival. It's communication. A story that deserves to be studied before it's erased by policy." The word policy landed like a stone. Caleb's gut tightened. BLM won't care about stories. Maya met his eyes steadily. "No, but science can shift the ground under law. Documentation matters. If we can prove what happened here, maybe they won't treat it as a violation. Maybe they'll see it as precedent." Her tone carried conviction, but Caleb heard only risk. "Or maybe I'll lose him faster." Silence settled, heavy as the frost outside. Ash nickered low, her breath steaming. Lucky pressed against Caleb's leg, warm and solid. He rested a hand on the foal's mane, torn between fear and the faint pull of hope. Maya rose, brushing straw from her knees. "I can't promise protection, but I can offer data. Weight charts, respiration logs, photographic evidence. The kind of proof that makes agencies pause before they act." She closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "If you want to keep him, even just long enough to grow strong, this is your best chance." Caleb rubbed his temples, the old ache of doubt gnawing at him. But when he looked at Lucky, alive, bright-eyed, ears flicking at June's laughter, he knew there was no retreat. The law might come, the rumors might swell, but turning away now would be a betrayal heavier than any fine. He gave a short nod. "Fine, help me keep him alive. But this stays quiet." Maya's lips curved into the faintest smile. Quiet as the wind. That night, Caleb sat by the lantern glow, notebook open. His handwriting was steadier than it had been in weeks. Vet examined Lucky. Strong heart. Improving. Evidence could protect or condemn. Risk grows, but so does hope. He closed the book, listening as Lucky gave a playful snort, answered instantly by Ash's nicker. The sound threaded through the darkness, binding them all together. Outside, the frost deepened. The plains waited, silent but watchful, as though the land itself understood that proof was a blade that could cut in either direction. The first, snow came thin and dry, carried sideways by the wind, stinging as it touched skin. Caleb Brooks pulled his hat lower as he crossed the yard, boots crunching against the frosted ground. The shed glowed warm in the dim light, smoke curling faintly from the stovepipe he had rigged to keep the chill away. Inside, Lucky shifted restlessly, no longer the fragile shadow he had been, but a colt gaining strength each day. His eyes held brightness now, his legs steadier, his whinnies clearer. Ash never strayed far, her silhouette a constant guardian against the pale horizon. Maya Ellison had been visiting regularly, each time with her notebook, her calm efficiency, and her steady presence. June followed her closely, eager to learn, writing her own careful notes, as though the foal's progress were a school lesson. Caleb pretended indifference, but found himself listening to every word, memorizing each measure of weight and pulse. It was knowledge he never thought he would need, yet it filled his evenings as much as the notebook he had inherited from his father. But with the snow came pressure. Rumors had thickened into questions, questions into warnings. Jonah had returned one night, his expression grave. "BLM will come soon," he said, his breath clouding in the lantern glow. "You can't keep the world out forever." Caleb didn't answer. He looked at Lucky, dozing peacefully, and knew Jonah was right. Silence could not hold against the tide. The confirmation came days later. A county sheriff's truck pulled into the yard, followed by a government SUV bearing the Bureau's insignia. Caleb's stomach dropped as he stepped onto the porch, his jaw set. Ash raised her head from the fence line, nostrils flaring, her body taut with unease. Dana Short climbed from the SUV, the brim of her hat dusted with snow. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence spoke louder than words. She scanned the yard, eyes lingering on the shed, before turning to Caleb. "We need to talk." Inside the farmhouse, the stove cracked with heat, while tension filled the room. Maya sat at the table, notebook closed, but her gaze unwavering. June lingered near the door, eyes wide, silent but defiant. Jonah leaned in the corner, arms folded, his silence carrying the weight of generations. Dana spoke evenly, her voice clipped with authority. "Rumors are one thing. Proof is another. We've had reports of a foal on this property. If you're harboring a wild horse, Caleb, you know what that means." Caleb met her eyes, unflinching. "I didn't go looking for them. They found me." Dana's brow furrowed. "The law doesn't bend for stories. Wild horses fall under federal management. Keeping them is illegal." Before Caleb could answer, Maya spoke, her tone calm but sharp as a scalpel. "This isn't a typical case, Ranger. The mayor sought him out. The foal wouldn't be alive without his intervention. That's not just anecdote. It's behavior we can document. If you seize him now, you lose the chance to understand something extraordinary." Dana's eyes narrowed. "Science doesn't excuse violations." "Science changes policy," Maya countered. "And if you want people to respect the Bureau, you show them you can recognize when nature teaches us something new." The words hung in the air. Jonah finally spoke, his voice low. "The land doesn't send messengers often. If you silence this one, you'll answer to more than paper law." Dana's gaze flicked to Caleb again, her jaw tight. "If I walk away, you stay silent. No parades, no podcasts, no feeding town gossip. You keep it contained. Do you understand?" Caleb clenched his fists. He hated the compromise in her tone, the way his life had become a negotiation. Yet he saw the faintest opening in her stance, the sliver of humanity beneath the uniform. He nodded once. "I understand." Dana exhaled, long and controlled. "Then we'll call this a temporary allowance, on the condition Maya provides weekly data. If anything changes, if the foal becomes a spectacle, it ends." The meeting ended as abruptly as it began. The vehicles pulled away, leaving only tracks in the snow. Caleb stood in the yard, the cold searing his lungs, watching until the dust settled. Ash pressed close to the fence, her eyes questioning. Lucky nickered faintly from the shed. Maya stepped beside him. "You bought time," she said quietly. Caleb nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. Time isn't forever. That night, he sat at the table with his notebook open, ink scratching across the page. Sheriff and BLM came. Agreement made. Weekly reports. Bought time. Nothing more. He stared at the words until they blurred, then closed the book. The stove popped. Lucky's distant whinny threaded through the walls, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt steady. But as the wind howled across the plains, Caleb knew bargains with law carried edges sharp enough to cut deep. The fight was not over. It had only shifted ground. The thaw came suddenly, a warm wind sweeping down from the high country and loosening winter's grip. Snowmelt trickled along fence posts and pooled in low spots across the yard. Caleb Brooks felt the change in his bones. Seasons had always ruled the rhythm of his life, but this year the shift carried something heavier. Lucky had grown strong, legs straight, coat gleaming in the pale sun. Ash no longer lingered at the edge of the shed every hour. She drifted farther, testing distance, yet always returned when the colt called. The pattern was changing. Caleb knew what it meant, though he tried not to name it. Inside the house, June was finishing her homework at the kitchen table, pencil tapping against the page. She glanced at him often, sensing the tension he tried to hide. When he stepped out with his coffee, she followed, her boots crunching against thawed gravel. Together they watched Lucky stumble run along the paddock, kicking up mud as Ash circled him in slow arcs. "He's not a baby anymore," June said softly. Caleb nodded, throat tight. "No, he's not." The fragile agreement with BLM had bought them time, but time was a currency that always ran out. Riley Park's podcast had continued to spread, despite Caleb's silence. Now, half-truths painted him either a renegade savior or a fool risking fines. Strangers had begun leaving notes at his gate, some praising him, others warning him. Each paper, each glance from the road pressed him closer to the truth. The world knew, and the world would not look away. That afternoon, Jonah Blackbear arrived, his truck rattling up the drive. He carried no judgment in his eyes, only the gravity of someone who had seen cycles of loss and return more times than he could count. He leaned on the fence, watching Lucky nuzzle at Ash's flank. "He's strong enough now," Jonah said quietly. "The land is calling them back." Caleb's chest ached at the words. He wanted to argue, to hold on, to insist Lucky still needed him. But deep down he knew the bond between mare and colt was stronger than anything he could offer. He had been a bridge, nothing more, carrying Lucky from death's edge to life. Bridges are meant to be crossed, not kept. That night, Caleb sat long at the kitchen table, his notebook open. Ink bled across the page as he wrote, "Ash grows restless. Lucky runs stronger. Jonah says they are ready to return. I am not ready, but it is not my choice." He set the pen down, his hand trembling. For years he had lived in routine, in silence. This colt had forced him to remember what it meant to care again. Letting go felt like tearing something newly healed. Morning came clear and cold. Caleb stepped outside to find Ash and Lucky waiting near the open stretch of the north fence. Ash's body was taut, her head turned toward the ridge. Lucky pranced beside her, eager but uncertain, as if sensing change in the air. June stood nearby, her hands clenched in her jacket sleeves. "Is this it?" she whispered. Caleb couldn't speak. He only nodded. He walked slowly to the colt, laying a rough hand along Lucky's neck. The young horse pressed into his palm, warm and solid, the weight of trust undeniable. Caleb bent, his voice low, breaking as he whispered, "You made it, boy. You're strong now. Be free." Ash called, a sharp, urgent cry that echoed across the thawing plain. Lucky flicked his ears, glanced once more at Caleb, then trotted to her side. Together they moved toward the open land, the morning sun catching their coats in a blaze of silver and gold. Caleb watched, his chest aching with pride and loss as they slipped beyond the fence line and into the horizon. June stood beside him, tears streaking her cheeks. "They'll come back, won't they?" He swallowed hard. "Maybe. But even if they don't, we'll know they're where they belong." The yard felt impossibly quiet once their shapes vanished into the distance. Caleb's hand rested on the fence rail, rough wood pressing into his palm. He had given them freedom, but it felt like something had been taken from him in return. That evening, he opened his notebook and wrote one final line for the day. "Letting go is heavier than holding on, but sometimes it's the only way to keep what matters alive." He closed the book slowly, the sound echoing through the silent kitchen. Outside, the wind carried faint traces of hoofbeats across the thawing earth, fading but never gone. Caleb leaned against the window, eyes closed, and for the first time in years allowed the silence to settle without resistance. It was no longer empty. It was full, with memory, with meaning, with the promise of lives he had helped carry back into the wild. The days after their departure stretched wide and unfamiliar. Caleb Brooks woke before dawn as always, the silence of the house steady as the tick of his father's old clock. He pulled on his boots, stepped into the cold, and felt the absence in every corner of the yard. No colt's shaky whinny, no dark silhouette of a mare pacing the fence line. Only wind curling through dry grass and the steady bleat of cattle. Yet something had shifted. The emptiness did not hollow him the way it once had. Instead, it carried a quiet weight, like a photograph pressed between pages. A reminder, not a wound. June Alvarez noticed it too. She still came each weekend, though her eyes now searched the horizon more than the shed. Sometimes she would pause in her chores, listening, as though expecting the faint sound of hooves. Caleb never teased her for it. He found himself doing the same. Jonah Blackbear visited one evening, leaning against the porch rail as the sky burned rust and violet. He smoked in silence, then said, "They'll be out there, part of the land again. You were the bridge. That was your place in their story." Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched the sun dip low, shadows spilling long across the pasture. Finally, he said, "Funny thing about bridges. You don't know how much you need them until you cross." Jonah nodded, his lined face softening. "And once you've crossed, the land doesn't look the same." After Jonah left, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open. The entries of the last weeks filled page after page. Weights, feedings, Lucky's first steps, the braid in Ash's mane. He traced the lines with his calloused thumb, then closed the book gently. Instead of writing data, he lifted his pen and wrote something different. "Love once given isn't lost. It becomes part of the land, carried forward in every echo, in every breath of wind over grass." The farm settled back into routine. Caleb mended fences, hauled water, tallied cattle. But each task felt touched by something larger. When he heard coyotes at night, he thought of Lucky's first broken whinny answering Ash. When he saw clouds gathering over the basin, he remembered the desperate climb out of the ravine. And when he walked the ridge, notebook in hand, he sometimes thought he caught the faint sound of hooves, a whisper across distance, too soft to prove yet too real to deny. One evening, near the turn of spring, Caleb rode out to the high ground where the land opened like an ocean. The wind carried the scent of sage and thawing earth. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then, faint and sharp, a whinny carried across the horizon. He opened his eyes quickly, but the ridges lay empty, no shapes against the sky. Still, his chest tightened, not with grief, but with something gentler, steadier. He touched Dusty's neck, the old gelding shifting beneath him. "Let's go home," he said softly. The horse moved forward, sure-footed, as the light thinned to gold. Behind them, the hills held their silence, yet within it lingered an echo, a reminder that a wild mare once sought him, that a colt once survived in his hands, and that some chances, once taken, change everything. As Caleb rode back toward the farmhouse, lanterns glowing warm in the windows, he carried that echo with him. Not a ghost, not a burden, but a promise that even loss can leave behind a fullness, and even silence can speak of love that endures. And now, I want to hear from you. If you believe every soul deserves a second chance, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Your voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of wild hearts, fragile bonds, and second chances are coming your way. Stay with us for the next journey. You won't want to miss it.